So the next part of your lesson plan template is called language supports, and I want to be very clear that language supports are something that were invented by Pearson, a testing company, and it is not something that you will typically see on most lesson plans from this point after you've completed your EdTPA portfolio. The reason why we're going over it today is because I want to make sure that you're as comfortable as possible so that when it comes time to submit your EdTPA portfolios for certification, you have no problems with language supports. You're super comfortable with them because you've been practicing and trying to develop them. As I've sort of mentioned already, they are important considerations, but not part of a traditional lesson plan template. Your mentor teacher, if you ask for help about a language support, they will probably look at you funny because they probably have never seen a language support. And so we're going to talk about it just very briefly today so that you understand what language supports are. So they are some type of scaffolding. That's what a language support is, that helps teachers provide students with complex elements associated with English language arts. So examples of language supports, think about things that will help students better understand concepts. So what are some tools or what are some things you can provide for them that help them throughout the entire process? So something like a graphic organizer is a device that helps students sort of organize their thinking on paper as a way of trying to get them to focus on particular skills that you're teaching them. Other things that might be useful are anchor charts. Those are usually giant pieces of paper that you see posted on the wall, and they might have big ideas for a unit like if you're studying dystopian literature, what makes dystopian literature dystopian? So what are some features of those texts? You might also see things like word walls, and those are important vocabulary terms that are posted up maybe on a bulletin board somewhere so that students can quickly reference them. Other reference materials, perhaps instead of a word wall, you have like vocabulary lists that students can reference back and forth, just as a quick and easy tool for them for any ideas or terms that may be confusing. And it does not need to be necessarily a physical item. It could be an activity that you do that helps students better understand complex ideas. There are three types of language supports that they'll be looking for, or language demands as they call them. Language functions, vocabulary, and then syntax/discourse. A language function, this is most similar to, if you remember looking at the objective section when we talked about Bloom's taxonomy. They are the major verbs that you want students to be able to do within a particular lesson segment. And so what is the main focus? What do you want students to be able to do during your lesson segments? And so EdTPA provides 8 examples of what they think are pretty typical language functions: analyze, argue, describe, evaluate, explain, interpret, justify, and synthesize. So those are the 8 main language functions they identify. You are certainly not limited to them. But they are ones that typically people choose. If you think about a language function, what they mean is if you're reading a text and you want students to annotate and do things with text like that, you might be in that analyzing space. If you are studying things like persuasive writing, you might look at the element of argument. And so all of these relate in some way to skills that we would expect from English language arts students. You just need to figure out what is the main language function, what is the skill you want them to do. And then you have to think about what activities you'll be doing to help students master that language function, and better yet, what materials will you provide them? And so what are some supports that can help students analyze a text a little bit clearer? Vocabulary obviously is important to English language arts, but in EdTPA speak, they don't mean just pulling out big words from a text that students might find confusing. So they're not talking about sight words, they're not talking about some of those 2-cent words that we often encounter in text. Instead, they are talking about here the academic vocabulary that students need to know. So they're not looking for a list of SAT words, they want to know how you're going to support students in using academic vocabulary. So rather than choosing, fancy words that may appear that students may be unfamiliar with, think about the academic vocabulary. Things like theme, inference, compare, contrast, metaphor. Those are the vocabulary terms that might come along with, for example, doing some analysis of a text. And so you can see how your language function is then connected to your vocabulary. So what sort of vocabulary is important to your analysis of a text? And again, you want to think about what are the tools that will help students master these vocabulary terms to be able to apply those vocabulary terms. And then the next part is syntax/discourse. Now, it's important to note that in your lesson plans, you need to choose between syntax or discourse. You don't do both typically, you just choose one. And so syntax and discourse both deal with this notion of structure, okay? So syntax, traditionally, we talk about how a sentence is structured. What are the pieces of a sentence? And so that is an organizing element, but you can also, in EdTPA speak, you can also look at the ways in which a text is organized. And so you might look at perhaps the stanzas in a poem and talk about the structures of poetry in that way. So that's what they mean by syntax, not just the sentence structure, but other structural elements of a text as organizing functions. Discourse, again, we talk about the way that academic readers speak in a particular way, and that's similar to vocabulary. But again, you're talking about the structures of written and oral language. So how do people in the discipline of literacy and literature talk, right, and participate in knowledge construction? So what do we expect? What is the academic structure of a text? And so thinking about this in terms of like persuasive essays, you may have chosen persuasive essay as part of your language function. And so when you're looking at it, you have this notion of persuasion. And then what are the structures of a persuasive essay? Well, you have claims, and then you have supporting evidence, and you have counter arguments. Another example, if you think about analysis. So let's say that you chose the language function of analyze, and then you want to analyze a text for a plot. And so you have analysis as your language function, you have plot as your main vocabulary term, and then you think about what are the organizing structures of plot. Well, you have exposition, you have rising action, you have climax, falling action, and conclusion, and or denouement. And all of those different pieces are the structures of a text. And so again, you would just choose one, either syntax or discourse, to talk about in your lesson plans. Then you want to think, of course, about how are you going to support students in understanding the structure of a text. And so you can see in my example here from the Giver, what I do is two things. Is first I analyze what is, for example, the language function. I chose the word apply. And then I think about what is the support I'm going to provide for students in applying that knowledge and understanding what it means to apply what they believe about the role of careers in society to a text, so that application element. And that language support will come in an activity about careers, that opening activity that I'm doing with students. Over here you will see vocabulary. The vocabulary that I'm choosing is setting and characterization. Again, that's the academic vocabulary that's important to chapters 1 and 2, establishing sort of that expositional element of a text. And then students use this language through a reading guide. So I'll be supporting students' ability to use terms like setting and characterization, and I'll be supporting them through that using this reading guide. Just a quick note, reading guides are not necessarily the best way to organize these, but they are one way. You might also, as I mentioned before, think about how you can create a graphic organizer or use a graphic organizer that delineates or sets up the organization of setting and characterization in the beginning of a text. And then lastly, I chose between syntax and discourse. I chose discourse, and the academic discourse of dystopian literature is what I focused on. So as I mentioned before, the summative assessment is students will have to create their own utopian society. And so I created then an anchor chart, so a tool that students can reference throughout the reading of The Giver that I would post in the front of the classroom so that they can see it and reference it to say, oh, that's one element of dystopian societies over here, and make that comparison. So it's a way of supporting them through that entire process. Again, this is a complex concept. All three of these are complex, and so we will work through what it means at each stage of our lesson planning process and how to incorporate language supports a little bit closer to EdTPA. But I want you to start thinking about what the different elements are of language function, vocabulary, syntax, in discourse, and then what sort of language supports you can provide at this point.